Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. I used to think the Tarkin massacre was hilarious. Back when it was just like a side story in the background of Legends novels like Rebel Dawn, because it was such a cartoonishly evil act. Wilhuff Tarkin refuses to yield to a group of Ghorman protesters who are blocking his landing pad, and so he decides to land the ship on top of them, killing hundreds. My sense of humor has always been like this. It's very, I guess, like Northeast working class. Nothing is sacred. But to hear that young busboy talk about his own experiences during the actual massacre, to see what this world is going through now, years later, is actually pretty haunting.
Who would land a cruise on a crowd full of unarmed citizens? I was with my father. He was killed, saving me.
The Tarkin doctrine in practice is especially horrific because it's an actual policy that utilizes massacres and violence as a deterrent, as a means for control over the population. You know, this isn't just disgruntled American soldiers at My Lai or Russian soldiers at Bucha. I mean, those are both very horrific and horrible moments in history. But the Tarkin doctrine reflects an ideology that comes directly from the Emperor himself. When massacres are a policy, not just the isolated actions of, undisciplined soldiers in the field, the damage that is done is far more widespread. And so, with the Ghorman massacre getting closer and closer with each, passing episode, it'll probably happen next week. The question I have for you is, what would you do if you were a Ghorman? In this video, we'll be taking a look at a bunch of different points of views, and hopefully by the end of this you'll be even more confused and further away from an answer, because sometimes that's just what life is. You're faced with lose-lose situations and you have to make a choice. Luthen Rael approaches Ghorman in the pragmatic way. He always does when encountering a new faction in this growing galaxy-wide rebellion. And when you're fighting the Empire, you don't survive as long as Luthen has without being careful like this. Every individual group, Saw's Partisans, Maya Pay's Brigade, Anton Kruger's Neo-Separatists, they have different ideologies, different motivations. They have different levers and switches that can be pulled and, levered against them. And so gathering intelligence and understanding how these individual factions work is incredibly important and a huge part of the job. And while it's clear that Luthen Rael has sympathy and empathy for all of these causes,
I didn't want you to have to make this choice.
30 men.
Plus Krieger.
he's already sacrificed everything for the larger picture. And so he will continue leaving bodies and entire factions behind, completely destroyed, in order to make sense of it all, in order to justify his previous actions. He's just focused on that one end result.
For the greater good.
Call it what you will.
Let's call it war.
This is the burden of command and leadership, and I think if you're smart, you avoid these positions greatly. I never understand these power-hungry people who look to become leaders when they grossly overestimate how difficult these positions are. Luthen sends Cassian Andor as his envoy to make contact with Cara Rylance. Now, Cassian believes he's going there to make an honest assessment of whether this group is ready to join the larger resistance. Luthen Rael has kind of a different mindset.
Think about this. Think about the Empire choking Ghorman so hard that even Cara Rylance gets off his comfortable ass to do something about it.
He wants to see if the Ghorman Front is actually serious about fighting, whether it's worth risking his own resources to support their coming out party. For him, the results of their small little attack doesn't really matter that much. It's what that attack can do for the wider movement. For Luthen, his mind is set. He has been living the revolution for many years. The Ghorman Front simply represents reinforcements and a boost to morale, something that they sorely need right now.
Ghorman in play? A new front line against the Empire? A chance for that's a triumph.
And more importantly, Luthen Rael understands what the Ghorman Front represents, what the Ghorman people represent. He's not some kind of idealist who wants to equally treat every faction the same way. No, he understands certain factions are definitely worth more than others. That is the cruel reality of his situation. Ghorman is not Ferrix, a forgotten world on the peripherals of the galaxy, which serves as a dumping ground for old Clone Wars era ships. I love Ferrix. I think a lot of fans love Ferrix. We love the people from there. Brasso, he's the real deal. But The truth is, most people don't care about Ferrix. They aren't paying attention to what's happening there. But Ghorman has soft power. Its spider silk is worn by politicians, celebrities, the rich and affluent, the very people who control the power in the center of the galaxy. A Ghorman resistance against the Empire cannot be ignored, and it will not be ignored.
Think about a planet like Ghorman in rebellion. A planet of wealth and status.
This is a hard assessment, but it's also the type of mentality that actually wins revolutions. The thing about guys like Luthen Rael is they already are in too deep. They have too much blood and innocence on their hands. And so to settle for anything less than victory would be a complete betrayal to all the people he's left behind. Cassian is still new. Yes, he's been losing people since the very beginning, but he still needs time to cook. It won't be until Rogue One that we'll see him closer aligned to Luthen Rael's point of view on things. This isn't so much about personal values as it's about experience. The revolution will age you, and as Saw Gerrera says, it's oftentimes not for the same. Ghorman is such a fascinating world. And we can't really begin to talk about the Resistance without really talking about the choices that Tony Gilroy made when it came to world building. One of you guys commented last week, I forgot on which video, that Tony Gilroy doesn't write from the newspapers, he writes from the history books. It's really a smart move, honestly. You avoid all the chaos and controversy that surrounds current news. And from what I've seen in behind-the-scenes footage, it seems like the Ghorman are based loosely off of the French Resistance. Although I did ask our European viewers last night when I was watching what they thought about the accents and the language and the culture of Ghorman. And I've come to the conclusion that the language and the culture that the Ghorman have are more focused on the Alps, which stretches from southeast France across Switzerland and down into northern Italy, where one ends in Milan, another center of fashion and trade that's not all that different from Palmo. The world building here is terrific. This style of European aesthetics combined with tradition and arrogance, with also a more utilitarian view of what a modern society can be. The Ghorman, despite having galaxy-wide penetration with their beautiful spider silks, still rely on small individual farmers who organize in co-ops and then are further organized at the national level. There is both a preservation of tradition and quality paired with the efficiency of modern industrialization and manufacturing. Kind of like Mineral in some ways, which despite the presence of undocumented workers still seemed like a relatively nice place to live. This is important because generally speaking, when authoritarian regimes rise to power, there's usually a bargain between the central government and the people, a trade-off of some sort. People are oftentimes willing to exchange their own freedom for security. Some are willing to exchange their freedom for a true champion in the culture war. Bonifer's theory of stupidity was never focused on what people exchange for freedom. It was more focused on just how dangerous ignorant people can be and how hard it is to change their minds. But here's the thing, with Ghorman being this utopian society that has almost a perfect economic system, the Empire is attacking one of the sacred agreements between the people and the government, and that is freedom for economic growth. In the few cases when more authoritarian style governments actually are successful and able to maintain social cohesion, it's usually through careful stewardship of the economy, which in turn creates stability in the society, as is the case with Singapore. One could even argue that China under Deng Xiaoping achieved similar results through their economic reforms, at least before the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre occurred, representing the central government's refusal to reform politically, which was very necessary at that time and still is today, honestly. This mandate to rule affects every government, even governments led by, dark side wizards, right? Emperor Palpatine is still beholden to the people somewhat. And the Ghorman, well, they have prospered under imperial rule until now.
Mobi Marklej vakodant sin bendele vanen. Dopazel mogardit. Orfik marcho à land umbralej. Madal, a mes sochtan. Glod pej. Maz blik vachem foladis. Sintrang poj elmun nimdagol.
It's clear that the Ghorman, being quite wealthy and affluent, have been able to weather the galaxy-wide changes the Empire has brought about. Palpatine was obsessed with control, and that meant also control of the industrial and manufacturing output of the galaxy. He seized entire planets of resources, aggressively took over large galaxy-wide corporations through so-called nationalization attempts. He's also created a wartime economy that honestly is as heavily leveraged and dependent on military production as Russia is today or as Nazi Germany was in the 1940s. We oftentimes think of tyranny as the jailing of dissidents and of activists. But economic tyranny does a considerable amount of damage as well, and in some cases does more damage, in my opinion. Just like a political system without checks and balances, an economic system without checks and balances can lead to gross excesses and eventually collapse. Now, the Ghorman really are not that sympathetic because they have pretty much, again, floated above all the nonsense that's affected other planets. They're also very much like Italy and France, countries that have very well-developed social systems that lead to high quality of life, and this is, of course, all driven by the high-valued added products they produce. The Ghorman, up until this point, have really ignored all of the warning signs that were coming out of the Empire. And I think that's because they've benefited so much from the stability of their role.
Bodogus en passport, pondem dialer smuleg en velor carapod si je peux dire. Foladis embrangastab.
Technically they aren't being killed just yet. That's still very hyperbolic. Just shows you how removed these guys are kind of from what's about to happen. And I think a lot of detractors, more extreme radicals, would say, screw the Ghorman, right? Where were these guys when the Empire invaded Minbam? Not a word was spoken as these privileged barons sold their expensive silks to the politicians and military leaders of Coruscant. There's almost like a disbelief amongst the Ghorman that they would be targeted because they are, they're not that type of planet that would get targeted, right? Only other planets get targeted. Which again is not a very sympathetic view to have. It also shows us a fundamental misunderstanding of the gravity of their situation. Although who can really predict the true evil of the Empire at this point? Not even Tarkin knows about Krennic's plan to gouge the planet for its minerals. Well, actually the Ghorman should, because Tarkin landed that ship on hundreds of people, and there's a monument in their square depicting the horrors and evil of the Empire. But I guess I'm not surprised that, that event has kind of been forgotten to a certain degree. Sometimes those who commit heinous crimes go unpunished. What is really moving the Ghormans now is that they find themselves in a place where things are no longer sustainable because their ability to earn money has finally been affected. Now, we could be cynical about this. We could criticize the Ghorman for not having moral clarity earlier, but I think the pragmatic rebel inside of me would say, we'll accept anyone who's willing to fight. Because this is going to be a difficult fight. Instead of pushing away people who might have differences from you, find commonalities, because you need a big tent to resist something as powerful as a galaxy-wide empire. You also have to accept the fact that people usually do not join the ranks of a rebellion until their lives are directly affected or they are unemployed and leave their work behind. Because, revolutions are a full-time job. It requires your full attention. And people who are sitting around without any future, without any job prospects, well, they're much more easier to radicalize, to kind of bring into the rebellion. Because what do they have to lose? They have nothing now. Which is why throughout history, nothing is more dangerous to a regime than a high number of unemployed people, especially a bunch of soldiers who have just finished the war and have nothing to do. In today's modern world, economics is everything, especially with how connected everything is now today. I mean, it's extremely difficult to just live off the land like you used to be able to. So forget about barbarity against certain groups. The German people knew about the Jews in the concentration camps, and if they didn't know, they witnessed Kristallnacht, the theft of Jewish property and stores, the many pogroms that were carried out during that period. These things, unfortunately, can be spun by propaganda. And also, very unfortunately, most people's empathy does not extend beyond their own family, and sometimes it doesn't even reach that far. It really wasn't until 1944 and 1945 that the German people awoke to a sense of collective guilt and horror. And this was really caused by the loss at Stalingrad in 1943, a major turning point for the Nazi regime, which led to rationing of basic goods and supplies. It was only until then that the majority of German people started waking up to what was happening. But yeah, as far as Ghormans are concerned, revolutions are hard enough, don't be too picky. The Ghorman are late to the party, but they're finally standing to fight. A lot of these individuals are actually quite wealthy, and they have the ability to leave and just off to some far corner of the galaxy and wait out everything. I'm sure a lot did, but a lot of people also stayed to fight, and so you have to respect them for that. And these individuals, they choose to fight alone. They choose to fight in the name of honor, family, tradition, and to protect what is theirs.
La reste en brège. Jakem soit prendre kofef. Sa kofef bonflo d'anvet. Schlinguez la hectarn. Et train-les-y. Et si, c'est moon. La bénage qu'une porc, la bénage tordée. La garte. Souvis cagrel.
And so yeah, I believe they are completely legitimate members of the rebellion. A group that should be welcomed with open arms. Cassian Andor's assessment of the Ghorman Front is kind of interesting, because he isn't as ideologically hardened as Luthen Rael. He definitely has sacrificed a lot, but he hasn't completely lost his empathy. When he meets up with the Ghorman Front, he comes with experience and quickly criticizes their operational methods. His view, just like his interactions with the Ferrex group, is one of compassion. He values the individuals sometimes more than the larger rebellion itself. But of course, with each victory, with each sacrifice, Cassian Andor is slowly losing sense of who he is. He will eventually become the person we see in Rogue One, who starts off the story murdering an informant who potentially could expose him. His analysis of the Ghorman are not wrong, though. The Empire has already won here. They have almost finished building an armory in the center of their capital of Palmo. The Ghorman Front lacks the logistical network and support system and experience to build a resistance army that can actually meaningfully fight the Empire. Cassian understands that not all rebel groups are made the same. I mean, just a year earlier, he encountered Maya Pei's brigade, which was essentially just an armed rabble. I think in a lot of ways, the Ghorman Front gives him a similar feeling.
I am who you want me to be, but that's just you getting lucky. People die rushing. You have no idea who I am. You need to be more careful.
Andor takes a look at the Ghorman Front's plan and breaks it down pretty harshly. He recognizes that these individuals are desperate and they haven't clearly thought out their entire operation, or what will happen once the Empire strikes back.
They want to hijack an Imperial transport to prove something that everybody already knows is true. Who's gonna care about it?
The Empire will care about it.
Exactly. In a place where they know nothing about fighting. They'll be crushed.
At the end of the day, rebel cells like this are resources. They are weapons and tools that leaders use to fight against the Empire. Cassian calls for caution. Perhaps one day the Ghorman Front can fight for the rebellion, but not until they have properly trained themselves and fully understood what they're getting themselves into. Luthen sees a moment, an opportunity to further accelerate the revolution. Although he seems less moral and ethical in this sense, he also has much more experience with the Empire. He's been fighting this battle longer than almost anyone, and I think in the larger picture, his views on the Ghorman Front are probably going to turn out to be right. The Ghorman Front's attack will lead to a brutal crackdown on the peaceful protests carried out by the people there. It will be horrific. Luthen will be responsible for this. We already know that he accepts this. He knows he's damned. Ultimately, what is more important is that the rebellion can still preserve their virtue and moral high ground. No Imperial was killed in the Ghorman Front's liberation of weapons, but many innocents will be killed by the Empire. And when you have violent regime forces cracking down on peaceful protesters, that is an incredibly powerful image, one that will move the middle of society. The Empire is also viewing the larger picture. Orson Krennic's obsession with the Death Star is why Ghorman must be destroyed, but the fact that Krennic has to still operate in the shadows means that the Empire's control is not complete. Krennic still has to fight the battle of public opinion, he has to deal with the creepy goons at the Ministry of Enlightenment, the absolute savages from the ISB Investigations Department. What he's trying to do actually runs counter to the narrative that Cyril and Dedra believe in, that order must be maintained. I think the majority of Imperials believe that that is what they're doing. They don't realize that there's another layer of Sith madness above their head. And this view about security and order, that at least is somewhat defensible, right? I mean, you just can't have militant groups hijacking military convoys. That is dangerous. It's hard for the Ghorman Front to really know what the Empire's true intentions are, but again, the fact that Tarkin's massacre occurred here and Moff Wilhuff Tarkin still remains in power and actually has been promoted several times in the Imperial hierarchy is a huge red flag. The construction of a massive armory in the center of the city, even if it's hard to confirm that it is an armory, is the second red flag, and one that should not be ignored. Which leads me to this more pragmatic view that might be closer aligned to Andor, that when the cards are stacked against you, sometimes it's better to not fight. It's not that I'm against people sacrificing their lives for a cause, but a lot of times people sacrifice their lives for little in return. I argue there's really nothing heroic about that, especially if you have a family or friends that you leave behind. In some ways, that can be considered selfish. Sometimes the victory is just staying alive. While Ghorman surely will die as a planet, the Ghorman people, their culture can live on in defiance. This is why Alderaan was so dangerous in the eyes of the Empire after the planet was blown up. The very existence of Alderaanians was a reminder of the Empire's cruelest actions and inability to destroy dissent. On this channel, I often encourage political discourse. I think it's something that's missing in today's day and age where most people are able to hold their political views in a vacuum, right? We've created all of these echo chambers thanks to social media. I mean, Generation Tech in some ways is also an echo chamber, as much as I don't want it to be. But whenever I tell people to engage, people with different political views, I always get this one type of comment, and it comes from the trans community. And they basically say to me, hey, Alan, how can I engage in a political discussion with someone who doesn't believe in my right to exist? You got me. I mean, that's a pretty tough ask, right? And I guess to those people, I would just fall back onto what I said before. Sometimes you don't need to fight. Sometimes you should choose your battles. Sometimes the victory comes from just surviving. You know, I don't know too many trans people, but I imagine it's not easy seeing your identity being brought up like in the news constantly in debates by complete fucking psychopaths. But yeah, like sometimes the best thing you can do is to take care of your own mental health, to find communities that are open and compassionate, that support you, because they do exist. They're out there, you know, everywhere. They've always been around. You know, find those communities, find a way to make yourself stronger and just survive, because that honestly is the biggest fuck you to these people, right? Who care so much about how other people live their lives that they'll go out and say mean and horrible things like this. Sometimes survival is just the greatest form of resistance. You know, that's just unfortunately what real life is like sometimes. I know some of you guys might be like, oh, that's a complete cop-out, Alan, right? But again, you know, this is why I like Andor. I think it reflects a certain truth about revolutions, rebellions that isn't talked about enough. I mean, look at guys like Saw Gerrera, you know, look at guys like Luthen Rael, Cassian Andor, Bix. They're either on drugs or they're just clinically insane. It's not an easy thing to go this route. And I really don't think it's responsible for media to kind of romanticize this type of behavior. You know, ultimately, it might be hard for a Ghorman to continue living on when his family, his business, his traditions, and land are all but gone. But in many ways, it's oftentimes just harder to continue after everything's been taken away from you. Sometimes it's just much easier to throw yourself at the enemy and sacrifice yourself, right?
Go live your life. Get out of here.
Go, no! Go, no!
I used to see this kind of nonsense in TV shows and movies all the time, and now it's all over the internet, right? You always see this meme where it's like, women want to die peacefully in bed, and men, they want to die on the battlefield in some last stand. That's complete bullshit. Like, there's no glory in death. There's no glory in revolution. You don't go towards these things for glory.
Come on. Son of a bitch.
Cherish your life. You're not a knight in shining armor. You're not Master Chief. You're just an ordinary person, and that's okay. You can still do things. You can still do great things. You can do small things that'll help other people. But don't go looking for a revolution, because if you're unlucky enough, revolution will find you.